In the past 5 years, the media attention that has changed attitudes towards gender equality has not been the result of feminist organizations. Instead, it has been tales of individual struggle that has captivated the world and changed mindsets. We are talking about stories like that of Malala Yousafzai in Pakistan, the 15-year-old girl who was shot by the Taliban on her way to school. And in the world of social media and social change, it is individuals, not organizations, who will proudly hold the banner for feminism. Our base principle today is what matters is the person, not the machine. And we're going to define what organized feminism is. It's a group of individuals wishing to campaign for women's empowerment who come together to form lobby groups and organizations as a means to push through such change. With that in mind, what do we mean by losing its relevance? And here, we're going to clarify our team stance for this debate. We have two prongs. First, whether organized feminism has kept up with altering social stances towards gender equality. And second, whether organized feminism can continue to fulfill its stated aim of effectively forwarding female empowerment and gender equality. No, thank you. We're going to forward three arguments. First, that organized feminism has become misaligned with the goals of female empowerment. Second, that organized feminism has actively hurt the progress for women's rights. And finally, in our second speaker, that it has been ineffective in gathering the critical mass needed to advance the goals of feminism. First argument, about how organized feminism has become misaligned with the goals of female empowerment. And we're going to ask a core question to start this argument. Why was it so important that organized feminism existed in the past? Because in the world before the advent of social media, the internet, and globalization, women faced legal oppression at every stage in their lives. The only way to gain a voice, therefore, was to organize themselves in large groups in order to present a collective and coherent presence against rampant misogyny. This visibility was important because it placed congressmen and employers under significant pressure to write more equal laws and also promoted fairer employment practices for all women. The kind of misogyny we have seen in the past wasn't targeted at women as individuals, but targeted at women as an entity. But before I go on, yes sir.
In nations where the concept of feminism does not even exist, organizations are needed to make stories known against the grain of censorship and mobilize support.
In nations like the ones in the Arab Spring, it was social media and the internet that allowed stories of people to be spread and the ideas of democracy to flourish. We don't think that feminism, or organized feminism rather, is an effective platform to champion such views anymore. Back to my argument. Times, however, have changed. Now, in the developed world, the fight for gender equality has descended from the courtroom to the hearts and minds of people on the ground. The collective action power of organized feminism has become irrelevant in the face of such soft discrimination in society. Why? The very notion of organization involves the removal of individual problems and struggles and subsuming this under a larger collective enterprise. The nuances in every individual's lives are sacrificed in exchange for broader organizational views and values. This is bad. Why? Societal perception and perceived inequality is experienced by everyone in a very different and very unique way. And the needs of a woman, for instance, who would like to break into higher levels in a corporate structure will be very different from the needs of a prostitute who would like to be respected just for the job that she does. And we think in trying to reflect all these interests, feminism has begun to fight for antithetical ideals as seen in the split between second and third wave feminism. We then want to apply this argument as well to developing countries, where I'll further deepen the clash to the analysis provided by the first POI. Organized feminism has become irrelevant there as well because of the growing proliferation of phone cameras and social media platforms like Facebook, giving previously voiceless women a voice to share their stories with the world. We give you the example of Sadaf Rahimi, an Afghan boxer who competed in the Olympics. And despite protests that this actually replaced the tenets of Sharia law, it provided inspiration to young Afghan girls seeking to pursue their dreams, who had read her story on the internet and watched her on TV. Individuals provide the human stories and inspiration for millions of young girls who believe that they can be whatever they choose to be. Organized feminism doesn't need to serve as a platform for information transmission with the advent of the internet and social media that has facilitated this already. Therefore, organized feminism has grown irrelevant because the push for gender equality in developing countries has been best forwarded to the humanizing stories of women, drawing acute global attention to such issues in the world today. I'm going to move on to my second argument about how organized feminism actively hurts the push for women's rights. I'm going to start my case from the foundation, if you give me a moment, that the splintering of the feminist movement has led to disagreements and tension within the push for women's rights. But before I go on, yes, sir.
This is an idealistic conception of the world. In many places, social media only touches the elite few in a nation.
Well, in these places like North Korea, we don't think that organized feminist groups will gain any more traction in the world today either. And we don't think when internet penetration is so low that organized feminist groups will be equally effective as you claim anyway, because the institutional structures still need things like the internet and electricity to operate within such nations. Back to my case. And we think that not everyone within the feminist movement agrees on what its next move should be. Andrea Dworkin, for instance, believes that all men should be trussed up and have high heels stuffed down their throats, while Naomi Wolf believes that pornography aids in the empowerment of women in our world today. Why is this bad? Because it leads to the illusion of organization, leading observers to view the feminist movement as disjointed and confusing and lacking support. What's worse is that often the most extreme and most radical groups, like the Society for Cutting Up Men, tend to be the loudest and drown out other feminist movements, meaning that it paints the entire feminist movement with an extreme and radical brush. This is bad because it leads people away from the feminist movement. Organized feminism is also inherently alienating and exclusive because it creates an in-group mentality that says, if you're not part of my movement, you're not properly championing for female rights, and therefore you're not actively helping the empowerment movement. This is bad because it excludes other women and people who want to fight for feminist rights as individuals. Individuals fighting for social change are comparatively better because it does away with the illusion of organization, not fighting for yourself and to correct injustices in your life, rather than fighting for the entire movement as a whole. Also, in developing countries, we think that grassroots feminist movements have been tainted by their associated perception with Western ideologies and more liberal feminists, feeding the fuel of extremists and turning conservatives and moderates away from their cause. Why is this the case? By promoting themselves under the banner of being feminists, even if there are grassroots organizations in developing countries, they will inevitably be associated with the label of Western imposed ideas of feminism. Sir. This is exactly why so many grassroots organizations in Bahrain and Tunisia and Yemen are desperately trying to disassociate themselves from the more liberal West. But to this day, they continue to feed the rhetoric of far-right individuals who still want to see women oppressed. And they point to feminist movements in developing countries as offshoots of a liberal Western ideology, and they say, look, you are coming here and imposing your Western cultural ideologies upon our nation, get out. And we don't think we need to open women to this kind of abuse within developing countries. Comparatively, individuals fighting for female empowerment are better in developing nations because it humanizes the stories that these women have and allows them to actually fight for gender equality on their own, disassociated from the wider feminist movement that could possibly taint them with Western liberalization. Therefore, on our side, we believe that we are better at forwarding the very causes and aims of the feminist movement as it was intended. Because our side protects women, because our side understands what's better for society, and because our side ultimately recognizes that organized feminism has become irrelevant, we have to go with proposition.
Okay, I thank the speaker for his speech, and to open the case for the opposition, we invite the leader of the opposition to make a speech. Here you go.
The only way women are going to be able to see further is if they can stand on the shoulders of giants. And that is what organizations provide. They provide additional leverage, they provide additional resources, and the abilities of women to see further beyond their own individual perspectives to a larger movement that exists in the world around them. So that's what our case is today. We recognize that feminist movements are actually more specific than they would like us to think. They're not just broad sweepings of all women's rights or all women's ideas, but rather the idea that general organizations, neutral bodies that like to campaign for human rights in general, like Human Rights Watch or United Nations, don't look at the specific needs of the domesticated housewife, don't look at the specific needs of Afghanistani women who can't walk on the streets safely. These kind of needs can only be addressed by feminist movements which hold as a core ideal the idea of women's rights and the abilities of them to forward their stance. Individuals themselves, not as like they like to contrast, but rather after you have that individual spark, what needs to be sustained in order to achieve long-term goals. That is what feminist organizations do, and that side fails to achieve that. on our side, we recognize that the outcome of many of these social movements is actually a legitimate organization which can stand for rights in general. We also recognize that our burden on side opposition is only to prove the relevant role of organized feminism has, and thus making it relevant in society. We're going to bring forth to the House 5 arguments. I'm going to tell you firstly about how it's needed to create mass movements. Secondly, how it's better needed to create funding and resources and lobbying abilities for these movements. Thirdly, that prevents it from being forgotten in the larger scale of things. My second speaker will be telling you about how this prevents homogenization of feminism and also how it creates a historical narrative for freedom for women. But first, 2 clashes to deal with on the other side. Firstly, can gender inequality be championed solely by individuals? Secondly, can their side really achieve progress for feminism? So the first clash about whether gender inequality can be championed solely by individuals. They try to prove to us that the context in today's world is perfect. Women can actualize themselves, women can themselves say as individuals, we want to change something in legislature, and that's going to work. All very well for some areas. However, if you're looking at the bureaucratic structures of government today, if you're looking at the context of civilizations, where in developing countries, women just don't have enough seats in parliament. In Saudi Arabia, they only have 1 minister who is a female, and she can't do very much because she's put in a subsidiary role to the rest of the ministers. There is no campaign or clout for these women to change anything in society. Individual movements, like the ones we talked about, like just individual cases of rape or deaths of the women, they spark media attention. But what happens after that? It gets lost in the drowning voices of the entire scale of the media attention in the world today. And that doesn't create the traction you need to change things in legislature, in society. But the second idea, that it's too broad to say that a feminist movement can in general accommodate all these rights and the individual perspectives of women. We say no. These feminist movements took at the specific stories of the women. In terms of the organizations, we have Red Stockings, a feminist group which believes strongly in the idea that women themselves should be greater than men, possibly even allowing them to say that we are independent of men altogether. These sort of specific aims compared to the general women's rights movement means that they actually promote the different ideas and variations of the feminist cause. So no, unlike what they said, these perspectives are included, and in terms of prostitution and all the different job roles of women, these women have their own councils as well. It's not relevant to this debate. Now to the second clash, about whether or not it hurts the progress of women in society. They say that the radical brush that's tainted by feminist movements is going to hamper and hinder the progress of feminist movements. No, we don't think so. The idea of a feminist movement championing for women's rights, in fact, has actually advanced the cause of women's rights in general, because people see it as a legitimate organization rather than just some sporadic groups that appear every now and then to just walk the streets and campaign and protest alongside a mass movement in the Arab Springs. They weren't heard in the Arab Springs, and there was no change in legislation because no one saw the relevance of women, and they were quelled right after that. So in their examples, in their ideas of women actually protesting along the streets as individuals doesn't work because there's no traction at all. And furthermore, the idea of having it a taint of Western liberalization is wrong because these groups are organic, they are surfaced within the grounds of these movements themselves. In Afghanistan, if they were talking about social media as being a platform, the women themselves saw themselves on social media and then started forming organizations and creating ground support groups such as NOW, which applies to actually international organizations and regional organizations where these women on the local base support their own cause. So no, their side doesn't stand because they don't deal with the realities of situations today where women need these organizations to push forward and allow for true change and feminine rights to be achieved. But to my arguments now, no thank you sir, about how this is the only way to create mass movements in society. The thesis for this argument is that women's rights can only be championed by feminist organizations which are organized and able to create mass movements for change. Why is this so? Because feminist movements are more willing than neutral organizations which are gender neutral to say we are vocal about women's rights. We don't care if it's just a subsidiary caution in the Human Rights Charter or in, hold on a minute sir, or in other legislation. We believe that it's a core fundamental of our organization. It should not be shunned out by others. But yes sir.
Given that conservative clerics and imams point to the feminist movement as branches of Western imposition, how does your side get any popular traction in developing countries?
That's the precisely same reason why the girls on your side still get killed. They still get killed because the religious sentiments are still on the ground, but there's no push for legislation. If you think that they're irrelevant to society today, then why is there still a growing need for women's lawyers, women professionals to band together to say we're going to fight for gender discrimination and laws in society today? Their side fails to achieve that. But moving back to my argument, because more than general organizations, they can promote the idea of women's causes and rights. They then can actually target the specific causes of gender discrimination and the problems in society. For example, in the developed world, we actually have mindsets entrenched by media and stereotypes where oftentimes 3/4 of the women in media are portrayed to be underweight models and of underweight status. This kind of impressions of women, entrenched idea that women should be of a specific body type, these sort of things promoted from young don't allow women to see beyond certain areas. The campaigns and abilities of women's organizations to move beyond this and to say you can campaign for your own rights is much greater than individual voices which just get drowned out in the wind. But in developing nations, moreover, because they don't have any idea what exactly their real idealization of women's rights can be, they can never see beyond their own personal scope to say, I can achieve this as a woman. And therefore, NGO Equality Now has 35,000 members in 160 countries to enable the women's rights and feminist movements to achieve their aims in these countries. Therefore, it's the only way to create mass movements on the large scale. But the second argument about how it's a better way to provide funding and lobbying. The thesis for this argument is that the clear organizational structure and prestige of an organized movement allows for the legitimacy of it in society. Why is this so? As mentioned earlier, there's a context where you have bureaucratic measures, things that hinder women from immediately standing up as an individual and saying, I want to promote this change. Rather, the legitimacy of saying we can have confidentiality, we have the legal resources, and the professional material to say we have traction is what is needed. For example, in the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women, you needed international alliances of many different women in many different countries with professional capabilities to say we can do something with the government and alliance with them, because there's no legitimacy given to individuals. To my third argument about how this prevents feminism from being forgotten. The clear, specific aims of the feminist organizations prevents the feminist movement from being forgotten. The goals pertaining to women, to domesticated chores, to the abilities of women to speak out in society, these are looked at by feminist organizations. Because while you see, in general, women being in the workplace, 30% of women in India are in the industry sector for science and technology. But are they in the top positions? Is the glass ceiling still there? These are necessary concerns only brought to the forefront by feminist organizations. On the other side, feminism is seen as a minority and unnecessarily radical and doesn't promote true change in society. Therefore, in order to make sure that society doesn't forget feminism, doesn't forget women's rights, don't let it get brushed aside and left to the dogs to eat.
I thank the speaker for his speech. And now to further the case for side proposition, we invite the second speaker, the proposition.
I'm going to ask two very simple questions in today's debate. First of all, is organized feminism still effective in inspiring change? And secondly, is it still effective in effecting change? On to the first question, is organized feminism effective in inspiring change still? And the first point they raised to us from side opposition was that organized feminism can be specific and isn't homogeneous. We're going to give you additional reasons why organized feminism is very likely to appear one and the same. Why exactly is this the case? Because we think humans have a natural tendency to want to listen to individual stories, to the lives of individuals, because they can relate to the common experiences whose experiences are related and portrayed in the media today. As compared to the other side, which relies on organized feminism, which is a very distant sort of approach, which drowns out and makes these women become faceless. We think that what we've said on outside of the house about how empowering individual women to speak up is far more relevant today. But comparatively, we think their side is worse for promoting feminism today, because their side relies on people recognizing the different nuances in the different kinds of feminist groups today. But this is unlikely to happen because people have a cognitive self-selection bias. What exactly do I mean by this? It means that people are very likely to succumb and only listen to information which already reinforces their pre-existing ideas. So on your side, if what you want to do is to change mindsets and people are already unamenable to that notion of females deserving rights, they're very unlikely to listen to the different kinds of goals that feminist group stands for and the very different kinds of means they propose about achieving these goals. So on that count, they don't inspire change. But more importantly, they never responded to the argument we brought up in our first speaker about how the more extreme kinds of movements drown out even the more moderate ones. And here we're going to give you an additional reason why this is the case. Because news media want to pick up on sensational news. and we think it's far more worthy of reporting about a society for cutting up men rather than about a moderate feminist organization which people more or less know about anyway.
Points, ma'am.
We think news media has an inbuilt inherent incentive to want to sensationalize and dramatize these kinds of feminist groups as being radical, as being irrational. On their side of the house, organized feminism is no longer relevant. So thank you, sir. More importantly, they talked about how the media entrenches certain stereotypes. Hold on, it's precisely this kind of media which provides the optics through which people are going to view these feminist groups and organizations in the first place. So if people are going to view females, for example, as weak and whiny, it's the same optics through which these feminist groups are going to be perceived. So thank you, Matt. On to the second question. Is organized feminism effective in effecting change? Here we're going to tell you that in conservative nations, it's going to be even worse on their side of the house. Because when the promotion of women's rights is already seen as antithetical to whatever the state believes in, their side makes it far worse when they make the threat such an overwhelmingly high threshold to cross. What happens is that it's directly perceived as a power threat to the incumbent government. But more importantly, within it, the backlash is going to be far worse on their side of the house, simply because of how radical it is to have a whole group of angry females marching down your street. But more importantly, they told us about how it's important that these feminist groups are remembered. We think that even if we're going to concede that these feminist groups are going to be remembered, they're going to be remembered for the wrong reasons. They're going to be remembered for being radical and extreme and being unable to reconcile with the rights of men as well. Last of all, no, thank you, sir, they raised the point about securing funding and lobbying for females. More importantly, the response we're going to give you is that they never told us what exactly this money is going to be used for. And it's most likely to be watered down and used for generic causes because of the bureaucratic nature of such organizations. On that count, we've proven to you that organized feminism today fails to effect change. I'm moving on to my substantive, hold on a minute, madam, which will further deal with the analysis we've heard coming from side opposition. But before I move on, yes, ma'am.
In your first speaker and in your rebuttals, you've told us that social media is what you choose to use. But does social media not also captures extremist views?
Of course, social media encaptures extreme views, but on our side of the house, it's far better when we capture the voices of inspiring individuals who have made a concrete, who have made a moving change in societies today. On your side of the house, which relies on organized feminism, which is very much distant, faceless, and emotionless, we think you fail to inspire the sort of change you want to achieve. Back to my substantive. Organized feminism is now ineffective in gathering the critical mass needed to further the aims of feminism in two ways. First of all, because it relies on outdated representations of men today. And the premise of this argument is that organized feminism typically seeks to demonize men and cast them in an unfavorable light. Why exactly is this the case? Because organizations and groups want to create an adversarial quality and strongly create a very visible antagonist. And the most visible antagonist whom they can seek to juxtapose themselves again is obviously that of men who assume a fundamentally opposite identity, which they do. And they rely on this kind of out-group devaluation in order to further promote their cause. We think this is especially bad because such organizations precisely entrench and create self-contained echo chambers of violence. For example, when the UN released the statistic that women typically work 20% more than men, this was construed by the radical feminist group, thank you madam, Femen, as evidence for the subjugation of women by men. How exactly does this make organized feminism irrelevant today? First of all, because we think that more and more men have been assuming positions of authority in order to be the spokesperson of feminism. A clear example would be Obama, who strongly campaigned for the passing of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act today. So we think it's especially harmful when these men, who are already taking an active role in promoting women's rights, are become unwittingly marred in the campaigns of feminist groups today. More importantly, we think because the kinds of discrimination we speak of are far less visible today. For example, women in the past were denied places in schools. Contrast that with the kinds of discrimination we see happening today, which is, for example, the kind of sexism they face in male-dominated jobs. We think it's no less regrettable, but the fact that this kind of discrimination is so much less apparent means that it's no longer useful to rely on demonizing men in order to get them to witness this kind of discrimination today. What they only do with organized feminism is to alienate men from this cause altogether. No, thank you, madam. But the second strand of this argument is that the cost of taking part in a feminist group are far too high today. And as a result, they are unable to secure the kind of female participation they so desperately rely on. Why exactly is this the case? Because in the past when women had their most basic rights denied. For example, they were not allowed to own property, they were not allowed to receive an education or even vote, the cost of taking part in a feminist group was comparatively smaller. For example, there might be other rights by their communities or friends, but this cost relative to the other suffering they had to suffer in other facets of their life was comparatively smaller and diminished. How exactly is this no longer the case today? Because we have to acknowledge that women have made some headway in gender equality today. So for example, there are clear laws in most countries which stand against violence for women. There are higher rates of university admission for women than men today. And because women have fought so hard for these opportunities and they want to seek affirmation for their achievements, they don't want to place themselves in a position where they potentially stand to lose everything they've made so far by taking part in the feminist movement, which is likely to be ostracized and shunned by most of the public for being radical and for being extreme. And as a result, we think that most females who have a self-preservation instinct will not want to take part in organized feminism in order to preserve the achievements they have really made. So ultimately, we are the side that recognizes what matters most is the person, not the machine. And it's a pity that organized feminism fails to recognize that today.
I thank the speaker for his speech and invite the deputy leader of the opposition to carry on the case for his team.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are two fundamental problems we see with side proposition's case today. First, they've told us a lot about how feminist movements inspire women to rise up, about how social networks, inspire women to rise up against oppression. And we don't disagree with any of that. But the line we forwarded from our first speaker to now is that organizations help continue these movements, help sustain these movements once the initial enthusiasm has worn out. The second problem with their side is that in their second speaker, as well as in their first speaker, they've also been debating a very small and radical conception of feminist groups. And as most of the distinguished feminists in this room would know, really, in the real world, feminists generally aren't like that. So moving on to my 2 points of clash for today. I'm going to show you how organizations are often better at inspiring women to rise up against oppression. Next, I'm going to show you how organizations are often better at inspiring women to continue the struggle. But we like to remind them of one thing. We don't have to prove that organizations are always better than social networking sites or mass movements. All we have to prove is that organizations still have relevance in the world today. No thank you. On my first point about whether we can inspire individuals to rise up, the only argument they gave us against this was that people can't recognize nuances in the doctrine of organizations. No, we think that's extremely unlikely in the age of the internet, when people have so much more knowledge and people are so much more empowered. No thank you, that's absurd. But we think that organizations have an essential role in helping translate abstract concepts of feminism put forth by theorists to people on the ground. And that's precisely why they're so important. That was an argument my first speaker talked about, something they haven't taken down. So moving on to the second area of clash. Who best helps forward the feminist movement after, even if social networking sites and mass movements are better at inspiring all of us? And we think the answer is organizations as well. Their second speaker's point was that organizations are too extreme to do this and drown out the voice of other organizations. No, thank you. Okay, but this is irrelevant to the topic. We don't think this is really the case because generally feminist movements aren't really like that. But we think that social media can promote such extremism as well. Social media often promotes instances of feminists, of bra-burning feminists, or feminists who seem blatantly upset. And this is propagated by chauvinists who want to paint feminist movements in a negative light. So that argument doesn't really stand, and if it does, it kind of hurts their side as well. Their second argument in their second speaker was that the cost of joining feminist movements is too high because essentially women aren't motivated enough today. We think that is extremely insulting to all the women in this room who have devoted a large part of their lives to joining feminist movements. No thank you. But we said if women really believe that they've achieved enough so that they don't have to join any organizations nowadays, they won't participate in mass movements raised by social networks and other channels as well. So we don't think, no thank you, that argument really stands. They told us then that organizations threaten the power of patriarchy in some countries, but social networks tend to do these too, which is why governments spend so much of money censoring Facebook and censoring the media in countries where they promote the cause of feminism. We say that organizations are especially important in these countries because these are a forced equalizer. They help to organize protests. They help to organize civil disobedience. That was what feminists like Emmeline Pankhurst rely on to get the kind of mass support they needed. Another argument to my first, which they haven't dealt with. They told us that the money which feminist organizations get can't be properly used. Okay, but this happens in every single organization in the world, like health organizations, organizations which promote all sorts of other causes. We think that this problem is a problem which is easily solvable. We told you that feminist movements are needed to navigate political systems which are heavily stacked against women by political lobbying, by ensuring that the voice of a small minority of women gets represented in a system which is often dominated by males, something social networks can't do because they can't organize people to make the kind of change within political systems they need. Their final argument was that political systems demonize men and lose support. No, in many countries around the world, feminist movements have so much to lose from demonizing men, which is why movements in countries like Iran and Iraq spend so much time emphasizing that they believe in forwarding basic rights for women, like reproductive health, not demonizing men. We think you're only talking about a small conception of feminist movements here. Moving on to my points. My first substantive will show you how organizations prevent homogenization within feminism. Why? Because organized feminism is better at allowing the needs of smaller communities of women to be represented. How does this happen? Organizations allow groups of women whose voices get drowned out by social networking sites, by Twitter and Facebook, by the majority to represent, hold on a minute sir, the uniqueness of their problems and situations, which the vast majority of women in some countries, well-intentioned though they may be, will never come to know through social networking sites. Yes?
On the comparative, is it easier for a government to censor a highly visible feminist movement protesting or the whole internet?
We think that it makes no difference. Governments in these countries can often cut off huge networks of internet all at once. And we say that at least organizations continue to exist even after an internet blackout because they can still meet in houses and in secret. We think that's patently absurd. Moving on to my point. Social media and mass movements sometimes promote the stories of individual women, but more often than not, they reinforce perceptions of what the vast majority of women in a country are like, without raising the problems that minority communities of women face, and without representing the victims of patriarchy in small sections of society. And this is a major problem, because in countries like Sweden, where feminist groups held a huge gathering to discuss this topic in 2009, women's rights have been achieved in many areas. Women sometimes stand for themselves, but problems for women still exist, which people all around the world, debaters, and people in that country generally ignore. Because communities of immigrants, like Muslim, Algerian, and Turkish women in that country, still face internal discrimination, still face lack of access to hospitals and being subjected to strict hudud laws. These separate needs are never heard through social networking sites, but they are heard through organizations formed to represent these women. Because it's far easier for women to form organizations than get their problems into the agenda of the elite who use social networking sites. Because these social networking sites spread views which are dictated by majority perception. We think organizations help amplify the voice of these women even when majority opinions and perceptions aren't on their side, and they make the views of these women heard and prevent these women from being sidelined by the majority. And that's why they help sustain the cause of women and minorities and fringe groups, preventing homogenization of women by the media, by Facebook, and by Twitter, and organizations are still relevant. I'm moving on to my second point of substantive, where I show you how we allow women to preserve a historical narrative of freedom to inspire the future. We think that the problem with their case is that in mass movements and social media, women may push for change. Small stories may come up to inspire vast majorities of individuals once or twice, but without clear leadership, it's difficult for feminist movements to concretize and pin down their historical record. This is for a few reasons. Because of information overload, because there's so many stories on social networking websites, and precisely because governments can manipulate perceptions of what appears in social media. For instance, Malala Yousafzai, the next day, was mourned by people all over the world. But the Pakistan government maligned her by calling her a slut and a prostitute, and their voice will become the voice of history if not for feminist movements who continue to defend Malala Yousafzai throughout time. We think that this is extremely important for feminist movements because it prevents people from seeing the heroes of feminist movements as people who didn't help forward the cause of feminism. And therefore we say, because organizations help to create and sustain historical narratives which inspire feminists throughout time, narratives which may be started by social networking sites, but continued by organizations, these organizations are still relevant. Ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that because the only way women can see further is by standing on the shoulders of giants, stand with opposition.
I'll thank the speaker for his speech and invite the third speaker of the competition to sum up the case for his team.
I have two questions. First of all, are the ideals of organized feminism relevant? Second of all, are the manners in which organized feminists fight for change relevant? First of all, are the ideals relevant? Let's start from a very basic question. What do women need in the status quo? We say in a large majority of countries, analysis that was never dealt with by their side, fundamental needs that most women can agree upon have already been met. This therefore means that the next step in which women take is something that's controversial. As a result, we said that it's systemically bad to have them all under the large umbrella of organized feminism. Let's give an example. Even on pornography, extremists like Andrea Dawkins say you should cut out men who watch pornography, whereas third-wave feminists like Naomi Wolf say it's good for women to be able to use their bodies in whatever way they want. These are the systemic differences in ideology between different feminists that we said it's bad to confuse and dilute the message of, which is exactly what happens if they come under this large umbrella of feminists. But then, if you listen carefully to the language that they give us in their second speaker, they said, we will appeal to many sectors of people. But what does this really mean? We first of all said that if we want to appeal to as large a base of people as possible, this necessarily means that you need to dilute the specific messages of each individual feminist within your group, because otherwise you only target a small minority of people within the entirety of the world. No thank you, madam. And we said this leads to several consequences, which I again want to emphasize we heard no response to in their two speakers. First, we said this excludes other women who might not stand for exactly the same ideals as them. This takes down their argument as well on homogeneity. Because if you think about it, on the comparative, if you're allowed to express your individual stories under our side, whereas you have to fit your stories within the grander narrative, which is generic and therefore vague under their side. So on the comparative, if they want to talk about homogeneity, that's what happens under their side. But we went on further, and here's where we again didn't hear a response to our second argument, which is that they can be fundamentally painted as extremists. The only response that we heard to this was in the second speaker, which is that they make up a very small number of people. We agree. But the problem here is that people perceive them to be part of the grander idea of feminism precisely because they are viewed as a collective under their role. Maybe they only make up a small proportion, but people perceive them to be a collective because of their model. As a result, we say extremists hurt the entirety of the moderate movement. But let me further an additional line of analysis. Within the movement as well, you cannot fight for change because there's systemic deadlock. Think about it. Feminists are not only divided in terms of their ideology, but in terms of many other things as well. For example, the justification for their ideology. Consequently, we say that there are no two feminists who can be said to be exactly the same. What does this mean? There's internal fragmentation, which means that feminist groups aren't even able to decide on what to fight change into, which means they can't even decide what to fight for change in. Therefore, we say that they don't even get their movements off the ground. There's clear precedence of analysis for this.
Sir?
The Voice of Women, no thank you madam, the National Council of Women, and Femen all banded together under the name of Organised Feminism, and what only happened after that was that they were unable to even get the ideas off the ground because they were diluted and there was deadlock. A deadlock therefore arose between both sides, which is whether or not the feminist movement can facilitate the spread of individual stories. I'm going to break this deadlock now by deepening this analysis. The feminist movement needs to conform to individual needs within society, and therefore it means that they will appeal to a vaguer notion of feminism which more people can identify with. Therefore, they can't tell us that there are going to be individual stories heard as well. But finally, they give us very strange analysis in their second speaker, which is that there are many different specific groups. Hold on a moment, sir. Think about it for a moment. If, as I've proven to you, feminists are as different as I've already shown, then they're going to be creating many tiny groups, in which case all the argumentation on funding and a groundswell of support is negated if the groups that they talk about are as specific as they think. Before I move on, yes, madam.
You're talking about individuals, which are even more diverse and varied than organizations and groups of women which band
That's a good thing, because it means that they can fight for the specific notion of feminism that they stand for. That's our answer to you. As a result, on a first level, the ideals of organized feminism are not relevant. On this ground alone, we take the debate, because even if their actions are successful, because they fight for the wrong ideals of change, we win the debate anyway. Second question, therefore, are the actions of organized feminism relevant? Let's first examine conservative countries, which has formed the bulk of opposition's analysis. We told you about social media. They said, well, social media also paints individuals under our side as extreme. That's untrue, because individuals under our side don't band together under the common name of feminism. As a result, even if some of them are extreme, other moderates are not tarred by the same brush. Therefore, their analysis isn't true. But next, they said, well, organized feminists can use these mediums and websites as well. Think about it on the comparative. Is it easier to shut down and notice a website if there's a groundswell of support, as they talked about, because of organized feminism? Or is it easier to, or is it more likely that these stories get out under our side, whereby it's propagated by individual people? We say on the comparative, social media works better under our side. No, thank you, madam. But then we went on further, and we said that they can be painted as aggressors. Listen to the sort of narrative that will be likely to happen in conservative countries. If women form national organizations, then people are going to point to them as aggressors who are threatening the patriarchal societies that have stood in our nation and are part of our religious culture. No, thank you, sir. As a result, we say that individuals banding together only threatens people and increases the chance of backlash, which is exactly what happened in Saudi Arabia after national organizations formed. The guardian system that meant that women need to seek the consent of male spouses was only enforced even further. As a result, we say that this only paints women as aggressors and reduces their inability to change. But next, we say individuals fighting for their stories work better. There are very clear historical precedents for this. Tajikistan and Zimbabwe recently criminalized domestic abuse after the plight of individual women, Asad Hojadel and Haya Chevot, were widespread over the internet. Comparatively, the national organizations, hold on a moment, madam, the voice of women failed, even though they have been fighting for these bills for more than decades. Therefore, we say that on this ground alone, it's pretty clear to us that individuals are systemically more efficient in fighting for change than their side. But before I move on, yes, madam.
Individuals are not efficient in finding a general ideal and principle to work towards. Doctrinal clarity only comes with an organized movement which has clear aims and...
What does doctrinal clarity mean? It means watering down the stories of individual people who might not agree with this generic concept of feminism. So you are using that argument as a substitute for analysis. But next they said, well, you need organizations to follow up on individual stories, otherwise they might fade away. Our side stands for having a groundswell of support, but this is distinct from an organization because it doesn't have structures of hierarchy within it. As a result, we say that as already happened in the Arab Spring, and they agree with us, you can have support from the masses without having them necessarily band to an organization. No, thank you, madam. That's our answer to you as well. But then in response to the argument on historical narratives, he told us some very strange things. He said there might be too many stories on social media. We said that popular stories tend to rise to the top of the newsfeed, and that's why people are able to select the stories that are most relevant to them. As a result, we say that isn't a problem either. Therefore, we say that on the ground of conservative countries which they want to base their analysis on, we take the debate anyway. But then what about the rest of the countries, the liberal countries that they never seem to want to talk to us about? These are countries in which social media is completely effective in fighting for the ideals of feminism. They never engage us on this ground. Therefore, we say that given that the large majority of the countries in the world, unlike North Korea, we say that we take the majority of the debate. Finally, they were reduced to misrepresenting my second speaker's argument by saying that, well, we are implying that women will stop fighting the moment that they have all their needs met. That was never what we said. All we told you was that the systemic ideas of demonizing men only cause further backlash and hurt the entirety of the movement. That doesn't happen under our side because they're seen as different individuals. As a result, the lack of success on the part of one doesn't hurt the rest of them because they're not seen under one large umbrella. Because the ideals of organized feminism are irrelevant, and so are their actions, what matters most is the person, not the machine.
I thank the speaker for his speech. And now to wrap up the substantive portion of the debate as a whole, can we invite the third speaker of the opposition.
We say that in today's debate, it is the side of the proposition that has misconstrued the entire ideas of the debate. In fact, they are the side that don't stand for the advancement of women's rights and are in fact the side that regresses the feminist movement. And all the effort that past individuals and past organizations have pushed towards to pushing the feminist movement to the area that we have it in today. we would like to remind you that it is not the burden of the opposition to prove which avenue, organized feminist movements or social media that they brought up is better, but on which side is still relevant. Here they question us to come up with a clarification on our first speaker's substantive on doctrinal clarity. We told you that they told us that doctrinal clarity waters down individual stories. But this is fundamentally not true at all, because organizations do so much to use these stories as their driving ideas, which I will forward in my first area of clash. Then moving on to the two areas of clash in today's debate then. On the first idea, are the ideals of feminist movements in today's world still relevant? And the second idea, on whether or not the methods which organized feminist groups know, thank you sir, are still relevant in today's world. On to the first area of clash then. This is a fundamental idea that they brought to us in all three speakers, that individual stories are more inspiring. But sure, we tell you, we don't see how this is separate from organized feminist movements, because organized feminist movements empower these individual stories by giving them the standing, the clout, and the respect among society. Because making these stories not only more inspiring, but respectable among society and furthering the position of these individuals. No, thank you, sir. Then their second idea that they forwarded us to again was that organized feminist groups are radical and extreme. But they've chosen to focus on only too small an area in today's debate, as we brought up to you in our second speaker. But I'll now forward with a new idea to this debate, that in fact, organized feminist groups are the ones that reduce radical and extreme ideas and reduce and remove the terrible stigma of extreme feminism in societies today. Why? Because when you have organized feminist groups, you have international attention, you have regional attention, and you have national attention on these organized feminist groups. People are held accountable in these groups. This eliminates the radical and extreme views, no, thank you sir, that are perpetrated in society by radical extremist individuals. In their world, what's going to happen? You have spreading of radical and extreme groups in their world because it's dependent on individual ideas to push forward the idea of feminism. You therefore have a whole spectrum of different ideas, which is present in both worlds. The only difference here, no, thank you sir, is that we have organized feminist groups that are able to present society with a respectable, with a accountable, with something that is of prestige and able to be relied on by society in spreading of these feminist ideas. So we tell you that we are the side that respects this. Using the example of the Coalition Against Trafficking for Women, an international movement, which was the first international movement to allow a law to be imposed on relating to the trafficking of women prostitutes. No, thank you, sir. Then they told us that our organizations dilute feminism. But we say that individual organizations dilute it more because everyone is speaking up at the same time. How is an individual in society going to decide which one is of better standing, which one is of more opinion? Compared to our side, we're the side that allows for the forming of one clear idea of feminist movements. We're allowing for the formation of a clear idea of feminism and a clear idea of what women's rights is. Whereas in their world, you have a jumble of different ideas in it, which in fact dilutes the pure purposes of the feminist movement in the first place. Then they told us that that organizations will be painted as extremists. But this is precisely why we need organizations, thank you sir, to defend the historical narrative, as substantive brought to you by my second speaker. Then they brought to us in their first speaker, substantive, an idea of Western imposition. They told us that because we are fueling extremist movements, that we are fueling extremist movements of organized, when you have this idea of Western imposition, hold on a minute, sir, in their world. But we're going to tell you why this is fundamentally not true, because organized feminism is created by the women themselves, an idea brought to you in my second speaker. You disagree, sir?
The feminist movement often has to reconcile very antithetical ideas on what best empowers women. How does it then forward coherent individual narratives in your world?
No, sir. We believe that the feminist movement and that feminist organizations are the ones that allow for every individual woman to step up into this organization and to then spread their ideas, their individual ideas of what feminist is in an organized, in a proper kind of circumstance, in a proper situation. What happens in the world that they propose? No, thank you, madam. They propose that we have social media networking and that we allow for every individual to stand up and have their stories. Perhaps that is a good, maybe in their world that might be a good idea, but we say that the fact of the matter is that they are not dealing with the fundamental problem that they brought up themselves, the dilution of that feminist movement. And because we say that at the end of the day, we are the side that allows for a coherent stance on exactly what feminism is, that we are the side that takes this clash. Back to the area, back to my case then, where I'll forward a new idea on the idea of Western imposition. We say that it's better that the ideals come from these countries that already have a standard for women's rights, that already have a standing and established women's rights movement, as opposed to coming from elsewhere, as opposed to coming from individual women who are perhaps hold an individual grudge over being raped as a child. These kind of areas These kind of individuals are precisely those that put forward radical, no, thank you sir, extremist movements. At the end of the day, we say that comparatively, we would rather have an organized stance with their organized. We have organized feminist movements who are able to prevent the extremist harms that they bring up. On to the second area of clash then, on whether or not this is the best mechanism possible. They brought to us the idea of the advent of social media, which was the main thrust of their first speaker's arguments, telling us that social media has allowed for the spreading of these ideals that have rendered organizations irrelevant. But we tell you that social media is not mutually exclusive. That individuals, we've already told you that individuals can't always get legislature passed via social media, which was a rebuttal of my first speaker. We are now forward a new idea to this debate. We say that social media is aided, no, thank you sir, by organized feminism groups. Here I'll introduce a spectrum of society in today's debate. On one end of the spectrum, we have those who are in support of women's rights. Majority of society are those who move with the majority decision. No, thank you, sir. And on the extreme end are those who are adamant against women's rights and against women standing up. And we say that it's that proportion of society that should be removed. What is the fear in society then? That feminism has that stigma attached to it, that it's radical, spreads radical extremist views. But when you have organized feminist groups, it comes back down to the idea of respect, because they are being able to help, no, thank you sir, by international, regional, and within their own nation, they are held accountable by these individuals. Therefore, organized feminist groups will be able to garner the respect of society, where you have established movement in society via their funding and via the recognition that they have. Therefore, this major proportion of society is therefore the one that will be able to rely on and know that they can rely on the ideas that the feminist movement is spreading. And then they told us that that North Korea always censors. But so what? So do many Islamic nations, and they are fundamentally not dealing with the problem in today's debate. And then in their second speaker, they told us that there's demonization of men in their world. But we tell you that men aren't demonized as their views are rational, as we are being held accountable. And here's a new idea for it to this debate, that men are demonized in their world. Why? Because radical individuals are not held into account, and you're allowing for these individuals who hold that personal grudge against men in their lives to spread their demonization of men at the end of the day. So what have we shown you on the side of the opposition? We have shown you that because we recognize that feminism is at the end of the day something fundamentally important to every woman, we recognize and we acknowledge the act of fighting for their rights that many women have gone through, that struggle that many women have gone through over the past. Because we recognize that at the end of the day, we need something organizational. Because the spread of women's rights will only be spread as far as society recognizes it, as society respects it. And that can only be brought about when you have organized feminist groups. Because the opposition is a side that recognizes that the only way women can see further is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Stand with the opposition.
So now moving to the team's 4 minutes reply speeches. Delivering the reply speech first will be the speaker from the opposition team.
Ladies and gentlemen, today, Side Proposition had a vision. And I must admit, it was a grand vision for feminism and it was a grand vision for women's rights. But our problems with the vision was that we found it naive, we found it unrealistic, and at its worst, thoroughly deceitful. So witness with me the vision which slowly became blurry of Side Proposition. In their side, they wanted individuals through social networking sites alone to stand up and speak in favor of women's rights, because they told us that stories were really powerful. But slowly their vision started to blur, because these stories could never be defended from patriarchal governments, which had the libraries, which had the resources, and the historians to tell us that these stories were really stories of women trying to rebel against men who were only trying to protect them. And we told you that their vision had no way by which women could defend themselves from such charges now and throughout history. We told you that in their vision there was no one to continue talking about these stories, no one to remind people of why these stories were important, because they didn't have organizations to clarify doctrine, they didn't have organizations to unite people and make people more coherent in the fight for female empowerment. In their vision, they had no way in which they were going to make sure that the forces of patriarchy couldn't so descend by painting women as radical. because they had no way in which to defend women against these charges once the initial enthusiasm of their vision had worn off. Their vision was deceitful and unfair to the many organizations which do so much of good work for women today. It tried to tell us that they were fragmented, it asserted that they were extreme all the time, and in a very late advance in their third speaker told us that the deadlock that these visions generates disillusions people with them. But fortunately for the House today, side opposition happened to have its eyes open, because we told you that the situation was far worse when individuals were not united by an organization, by a structure which gathered them to perform tangible actions which helped women's rights, like organized protests, like lobby in parliament for funding. And we told you that even though sometimes these organizations are deadlocked, sometimes these organizations are a little extreme, this wasn't worse than the fact that without these organizations, in a world where these organizations were irrelevant, there would be no doctrine to unite them, and that was what my third opposition speaker told you, and we told you in our second and in our first as well. And so we don't think they've shown us why in their world organizations are no longer relevant and only social networking sites and the stories of individuals are. So what then was the vision of side proposition? It was a vision which accepted that social networking sites and individual stories could inspire women to rise up against oppression and against the forces of chauvinism. But it was a vision which had more clarity, which didn't become blurry as the debate went by, because it had organizations to channel it through funding, through lobbying in parliament, through organizing mass movements in countries which had no conception of feminism whatsoever and which needed top-down change to tell women why their rights were important and how to fight for them. It was a vision which didn't become blurry throughout the progress of history, because we had organizations to tell us why the historical narrative of stories like Malala Yousafzai's should be remembered the way we remember them and not the way the government of Pakistan or the government of Iran wants us to remember them. Organizations defended this narrative, and they defended the way we see women now in society. And we told you that organizations are needed to empower women and to show them why they had to look beyond the lies perpetrated by media controlled by chauvinist organizations and the lies perpetrated by governments in the developing world who would never ever accept that women's rights were necessary. And for all these reasons, because we've shown you that even if inspiration sometimes comes from individuals, organizations which work quietly behind the scenes and out of sight must still be seen and must still be heard today. The best vision for women is the vision they get when they stand on the shoulders of giants.
Now to conclude the debate and the entire tournament as a whole, can we invite the reply speaker from Team Proposition.
I'm going to end this debate by examining the two worlds we saw in today's debate. First of all, examining the plights of women and the side opposition's paradigm, and finally, the much more positive treatment that women received in the world of side proposition. But let's first examine the world of side opposition. What kind of a world was it? It was a world which too had very noble goals, and they wanted to empower females with the voice to speak up. But ironically, by amassing them into organized feminist groups in order to have their voices amplified, they only had their voices growing fainter and fainter. Why exactly was this the case? Let's examine what happens to a woman who wants to have a whole story heard by the rest of the world. She wants to tell about how she suffers from workplace misogyny and how she has to withstand sexist jokes. But what happened inside opposition's world was that her voice was drowned out. Why was it drowned out? Because she needed to fit her story within the larger, rigid organizational structures that side opposition imposed on her. Because they needed to fit into the grander narrative, and because for the sake of doctrinal clarity, which they talked about in the third speaker, that woman had her story simplified and that her voice only grew fuzzier and fuzzier. But more importantly, when the woman decided to step out of her house, she was only met by the hostile glares of men and women alike. Because first of all, her face was now hidden behind the blank of the organization, and people were unable to relate to her struggles. But at the same time, there were radical feminist movements happening elsewhere in the world. We told you about the Society for Cutting Out Men. So even though her feminist group didn't stand for that sort of radicalization, it was a pity that what she stood for was tarred with the same brush. They failed to recognize to the analysis we provided you very early on that media agencies have a tendency to sensationalize, and this is why we crowded the voices of even the most moderate. And this was analysis they didn't respond to. But more importantly, side opposition had two fatal flaws. They fell suspiciously silent about what they would do in liberal democracies where discrimination wasn't as bad as they claimed. But more importantly, they failed to recognize and respond to the fine distinction we drew right from the very first speaker about objectives of feminist groups and the perceptions when people receive this information. And for all these reasons, it was side opposition's world in which females suffered a very sorry plight. And with her female friends were unable to relate to the cause she was so desperately trying to promote. What was the far more pleasant alternative that we offered you in side proposition? It was a world where females were liberated from the very heavy burdens that side opposition forced on them because they no longer had to fall prey to the forces of organized feminism. It was inside proposition's world where the story of a woman remained intact, where people were able to relate to her experiences as they were amplified by social media, where more people could empathize with the struggles that were humanized because they weren't hidden behind organizational objectives. More importantly, it was a site in which women were free of accusations of being radical simply because their stories had far more personal touch, had a far more human touch to it. But even if radical individuals existed on outside of the house, and this is where we drew the comparative analysis for you about the worst case scenarios on both sides. We told you that how it was far better than having a radical feminist movement, which was far more prominent and more likely to be viewed as a threat to the very kinds of conservative patriarchies which side opposition tried to build this debate around. So we told you that it was only inside proposition's world where females were saved from hostile counter-responses and hostile violence by the very kind of patriarchal states which they talked about. It was side proposition which recognized this debate wasn't just about women, but also about men, and how feminist groups have a tendency to exclude men and paint them as very clear antagonists for females to rally against. And it was for these reasons that side proposition had a very simple and clear reason. That the reason why women can see further is because they stand on the shoulders of people, not machines.